So, last week we talked a bit about what happened up before the Civil War. In the early 1800s, the Second Great Awakening split Presbyterians into what they called the Old School and New School, which were further split into North and South by the Civil War. Congregationalists, meanwhile, were split between Unitarians and Standard Congregationalists, and more of them continued to move west, especially those of German descent. Now, after the Civil War, as I mentioned, the Presbyterian Church had split into the Northern Presbyterian Church, USA, and the Southern Presbyterian Church in the Confederate States, which at the end of the Civil War became the Presbyterian Church in the United States. So you had the Northern PCUSA and the Southern PCUS, very similar, so don't get them confused. Now, after the war, black Presbyterians in the South were told they could come back to the churches they had been members of, but with no real change in their status. They'd still have to sit in segregated balconies and were also not allowed to hold church office. As you can imagine, they said, thanks, but no thanks. Instead, northern missionaries from the Presbyterian Church in the north, both the old and new schools, which would reunite only a couple years after the end of the war, sent missionaries to the south to evangelize to these former slaves. Black Presbyterians, for the first time, were given autonomy over their own churches and voices in their presbyteries and general assemblies. Now, the presbyteries were still mostly segregated in the South, but that was not so much out of choice, but because the fact is most Presbyterians who were affiliated with the North were African American, because they had no real reason to go back to the Southern Church. Some did, and I'll talk about that. But Northern missionaries formed new churches, new presbyteries, and had a very special emphasis on schools, parochial schools attached to churches. It was not uncommon for a pastor to also be the principal and teacher at a school if you were a black minister in the South, because that was the only way you were really going to educate your people, especially with the end of Reconstruction in 1876. This is just a map showing some of the, you can't really see it that well, but showing the various mission fields of what was called the Board of Missions for Freedmen, and was showing various schools they had all across the South. Now, in 1854, a school had been founded in the North called Ashman Institute, which in 1866 was renamed in memory of President Abraham Lincoln and is still called Lincoln University. Now, this school put out a whole bunch of black ministers who would go south to serve these new churches that were being founded, though it still continued to have all-white faculty administration up to the 1920s. In fact, they didn't even have a black president until 1945, which shows how even in the more liberal North, there was still this system of whites overseeing black institutions. Now, one of these graduates was Jonathan Clarkson Gibbs, who was raised Methodist and was actually attended Princeton but never graduated, but he was ordained in 1856 and had been pastor of the first African Presbyterian church in Philadelphia. And he was the first black minister to go to the South to work amongst the freedmen. And actually, he was working in Florida and became the state secretary of state and also superintendent of education. Again, that was before the end of Reconstruction, when whites took back control of the state governments and kicked out black people in power. Now, in 1866, a Freedmen's College of North Carolina was founded by a man who had actually been a Confederate and slaveholder, but after the war became oddly devoted to the causes of the former slaves. It was named Biddle Institute for Henry Biddle, who was a Union soldier killed in battle, whose widow donated money to organize the school. A fun fact, in 1892, they won the first football game between two black schools. They won against Livingston College. And in 1923, they were renamed in memory of Johnson C. Smith, another benefactor. And it is still called Johnson C. Smith to this day. It is also the only historically black Presbyterian seminary in the country, now that Lincoln University has gotten rid of its theological program. Johnson C. Smith still does have a theological program, and it's almost entirely a black program.
Daniel Jackson Sanders was the first president of Biddle in 1891, and as such was the first black president of any institution in the South. He was born enslaved in South Carolina, and in 1879 had founded the African-American Presbyterian, which for 60 years was essentially the black Presbyterian newspaper, similar to what we now have as the Presbyterian Outlook, but specifically for black Presbyterians especially across the South. In 1867, the first black school for women was founded by Presbyterians. It's called Scotia Seminary, now is called Barbara Scotia College, since it merged with a college in Anniston, Alabama. It is still located in Concord, North Carolina. Mabel Parker McLean was the first black woman president of any institution in the South. They are sadly on their last legs in North Carolina. They are struggling financially or no longer accredited, and sadly I expect will close in the next few years. This is just another map showing the various presbyteries that have been established for former slaves across the South. Now, I've talked a bit about the Cumberland Presbyterian Church back in a couple classes. I guess it was last week I talked about them. They had been founded in the aftermath of the Second Great Awakening in areas west of the Allegheny and Appalachian Mountains. Because they had trouble getting ministers there, they separated from the Presbyterian Church USA so that they could ordain people who did not have the same, level of education. Actually, there's a good scene in the movie True Grit, the original 1960s one, where Maddie is in a boarding house someplace, and she asks the owner, she says, "Oh, you're Presbyterian?" She says, "Are you Cumberland or Southern?" And one of them says, "Well, I'm Southern." She says, "Well, I'm Cumberland and proud of it." In 1869, black members of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church requested permission to form their own denomination, which was finally granted 5 years later. It went through a couple names and is now known as the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in America. This is the only denomination that was ever founded specifically to be an all-black body, for Presbyterians, And to this day, it remains an almost entirely black Presbyterian body and still has not reunited with the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. They're mainly active in Alabama, Texas, and other areas out there. Actually, this committee I worked on at General Assembly a few weeks ago, each General Assembly, they invite several what they call ecumenical delegates from other denominations. And our committee, we actually had one of those ecumenical delegates, and it was the woman who was the stated clerk of the CPCA. So it was kind of cool having her on our committee. Now, as I mentioned, most black Presbyterians in the South joined the Northern Presbyterian Church, USA. The Presbyterian Church US, which was the Southern Church, wanted to kind of put a stop to this because they were losing so many members. There were many churches that before the Civil War had been predominantly black. There were more slaves than there were white members. And so their denomination, their membership numbers really plunged after the end of the Civil War. So in 1876, they formed the Presbytery of North and South Carolina, which soon was accompanied by presbyteries in other places in the South. Black Presbyterians, interestingly, were more commonly in the Southern Church than they were in the Northern Church, I think in part due to the influence of groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which were much more amenable to Southern Presbyterian black congregations than they were to Northern Presbyterian congregations, in part because they saw the Northerners as being outsiders, interlopers who were pushing things like voting rights. The Southern black churches stayed away from that mostly. And they also did not even have self-governance in their own denomination. They were able to run their own churches and presbyteries, but had no representation at any synod or general assembly level. So while in the Northern Church you had a mix of black and white delegates coming from all across the country, in the Southern Presbyterian Church, you only had white delegates coming to the General Assembly, even though they had several black presbyteries. In fact, they even tried, first I'll talk about this. In 1875, the Southern Church established the Tuscaloosa Institute, which was later renamed for Charles Stillman, who was the white pastor of Tuscaloosa's First Presbyterian Church. A fun fact, in 1966, so this was the college and seminary for black Presbyterians who had remained in the Southern Presbyterian Church. In 1966, John Rice became the dean, and the fun fact about him is that his daughter grew up on the campus. Her name was Condoleezza Rice, and you might know her as our former Secretary of State. So she grew up on the campus of Stillman because her father, so she's probably the most famous of the Presbyterians to come out of that tradition. But they didn't even have a black president until 1967. It is still active today as a college, but has long since discontinued its seminary program. Even before the northern and southern churches reunited, I think they started sending they had integrated Columbia Seminary in Georgia. Now, in 1897, the Presbyterian Church U.S., the Southern Church, tried to organize their black presbyteries into the Afro-American Presbyterian Church, which, although officially independent, was still under the control of the Southern Church. They expected it to grow and attract more black Presbyterians, especially those who had joined the Northern Presbyterian Church. That did not happen. Instead, it shrunk. And part of that was because of the lack of funds and adequate training so they could provide for ministers, but also just the fact that they were kind of a denomination that didn't have any representation. They were essentially a colony, if you will, of the Southern Presbyterian Church. They were allowed to represent themselves, but they still had no representation in a larger body. And even if they were officially an independent body on paper, all their internal dynamics were still being controlled by the Southern Church. In 1917, this independent denomination was dissolved, and the presbyteries were moved to an all-black synod called the Snedeker Memorial Synod, named for another white pastor. And so for the first time, they actually had synod and general assembly representation, but that did not happen until 1917 at the close of World War I. Now, I also talked a bit about the United Presbyterian Church in North America, which came from the more conservative Associate Reform tradition, also known as the Covenant Seceder tradition. They were a small body, mostly in the North, but were very much against slavery. And they had some missions which were not quite as well developed as the PCUSA, but were still moderately successful, mainly in North Carolina and Virginia, that they were under control of the presbytery in Tennessee. That's a picture of, I believe, the school in Norfolk, Virginia, which is still an active church to this day. Interestingly, the Dutch Reformed Church also tried to get their own missions going in the South. The Dutch Reformed Church in America, sent their only black minister, the Reverend William Johnson, to the South to try to evangelize. However, the problem was they had no other black ministers. And he started up 5 or 6 churches, all in South Carolina, and he was preaching at all of them, essentially, and could not keep it up by himself. And people would not go to a church unless they had a black minister. And so he got black ministers from both the Northern and Southern Presbyterian churches. And like I said, out of the 5 or 6 missions, most of them ended up closing. The other 2 became essentially union churches with the Southern Church. It was very bizarre. They were officially Dutch Reformed churches that were being administered by the Southern Church, but were using Northern Presbyterian ministers. It was very bizarre. I think even they couldn't figure it out because they all ended up closing by the end of 1926. But so that was a failed attempt. However, missions to freedmen were not the only missions that were going on. You had missions to the Appalachian Mountains, to the American Southwest. You had a whole bunch of territories that had come into control after the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. And with more and more land like California and Texas now under control, you had a lot of Spanish-speaking missions that were started. Then, of course, you had the international missions. Korea was a huge one, and that's a picture of a Korean mission. To this day, there are more Presbyterians in Korea than there are in the United States. Middle East and India and Africa, all sorts of places. And Africa was especially interesting. You had missions mainly from the Northern Church, but also from the Southern Church going to Africa. And in the 1890s, a guy named William Henry Shepherd, who was a graduate of Stillman College, a member ordained in the Southern Presbyterian Church, came to the Southern Church and said, "Hey, I would like to be a missionary to the Congo." Well, they wouldn't let him go. They were scared of having a black missionary unless he essentially had a white handler, essentially, to go with him. So they got a guy named Samuel Lapsley, who died shortly after the start of their trip to the Congo. Lapsley's great-great-niece was actually the president of my seminary, interestingly enough. But Shepherd became the first black missionary in the Southern Church and was really responsible for bringing to light the atrocities that were going on in the Belgian Congo at that time. And this was before they even had the League of Nations, but he brought it to the worldwide press, and the outcry was so strong that they actually interfered, and Belgium was no longer, it had pretty much been a personal colony of the King of Belgium, King Leopold. After this, it became a more formal colony with more kind of better treatment of the natives. But before that happened, it had been a personal colony of King Leopold, and the local people there were being treated just horribly. But Shepherd really brought these atrocities to light. Now, meanwhile, in the Congregational churches were still mostly, or still to this day, as we know, are autonomous. They're governed on a congregational level. But up until this time, there was no formal denominations. You had, with the exception of the German Reformed Church, the Reformed Church in the United States. Now, I do want to say a quick word of something that happened before the Civil War, and that was Antoinette Brown Blackwell, who was an abolitionist and suffragist, who in 1851 was licensed by the Congregational Church, and in 1852 was ordained to serve a church in an assembly in New York, and thus became the first woman in the United States to be ordained by a mainline denomination. First woman, maybe overseas there were some sects that were ordaining women, but in the United States to have a mainline woman as a minister, she was the first one, though she later became Unitarian, but she's worth mentioning for that reason. Now, the Congregationalists, though, were still governed at most by associations. So in 1865, they came together and published what was called the Burial Hill Declaration in Boston, which essentially established policies on relationships between congregational associations and churches. And in 1871, the next step was taken, and they formed the National Council of Congregational Churches, thus becoming the first congregational body in the country. In 1913, in Kansas City, they published the Kansas City Statement of Faith. This covered 3 items: faith, polity, and wider fellowship. On their faith, they moved more away from the traditional Calvinist beliefs that they had and really began their focus on social justice and peacemaking, which continues to be very integral parts of the UCC to this day. In polity, they affirmed kind of their past traditions, though. They affirmed that they were Puritan Congregationalist structure. And in terms of wider fellowship, they sought increased ecumenicism, so increased unions with other bodies. It is interesting. So the Book of Worship, which I have a copy of in my office, includes a copy of the Kansas City Statement of Faith. One of these denominations they worked more closely with was the Evangelical Protestant Church of North America, which German Protestants had formed largely around Pittsburgh and right here in Cincinnati. They were still independent of each other until 1885 when they formed their own denomination, at least organized it. And in 1927, however, they merged in with the NCCC, the National Congregational Churches. You had a lot of them, including our very own St. John's, right there on the screen. Most of the churches on the west side were part of the EPCNA, now UCC churches. Pilgrim, St. Peter and St. Paul, Price Hill. I think Price Hill was... Really? Okay. I don't know why I thought they were the Evangelical Synod. I should, yeah. Church, the old church down, St. Martin's, which is used to be down on the riverfront, on Riverside, on River Road, which has now been demolished, but the churches that merged to form Trinity Hill were also mostly EPCNA. You also had the Christian Connection, which had come about in the early 1800s by Christians from various denominations who were unhappy with their denominations. You had a mix of Methodists and Baptists and others, Presbyterians, Congregationalists. Some had gone on to join the Disciples of Christ or other groups like the Adventists. But you had a core that remained calling themselves the Christian Connection. They established Defiance College, which is in Defiance, Ohio. And in 1931, they merged with the NCCC to form what was called the Congregational Christian Churches. Finally, you had other Germans who were part of the Evangelical Synod of North America. They were mixed more theologically. They had some Lutheran influences as well, but were largely Calvinist liturgically and more Congregationalist polity-wise. In 1872, prior to that time, they had had various German synods, the Synod of the West, the Synod of Ohio. And in 1872, they merged to form the German Evangelical Synod of North America, though they later dropped German from its name. And I'll talk more about them next week, but most of the ESNA churches, probably the majority of the churches around here, Martini and Emmanuel on Queen City Avenue were both part of the Evangelical Synod. So it's confusing because you had the Evangelical Synod and the Evangelical Protestant churches. And it's easy to get the two of them confused. Okay, in the Evangelical Church, yep. The German Reformed Church, on the other hand, German Evangelical, yep. And I mentioned a bit, you also had the German Reformed Church at this time. The only one of those that really made it into the 20th century was First Reformed Church on down. You can see it from the interstate. I don't know what street it's on. Freeman Avenue. Yeah, you can still see it from the interstate. It's an awful shape. Yeah, 4 blocks from the old ball field. That's right. And I remember you telling me your grandfather was the pastor there, correct? Or no, you knew people who had been the pastor there. Because I remember you telling me stories about how the ball players used to go to that church sometimes on Sunday mornings. Dee Earhart, yeah. I know she grew up in that church. Dee, who sits back here, always wears purple, she grew up in that church. Now, you also had, like the Presbyterians, who had missions to the southern churches, who had former slaves in southern congregational bodies who broke away from their own churches and formed their own congregations. Some of them formed the Afro-Christian Convention in 1892. Others affiliated with the NCCC Synod of the South, but really did not merge as a body until the 1950s, when they really became kind of... Most of the churches in the South were black. It wasn't until... Well, I take that back. I shouldn't say all of them, but many of them were African American in the Congregational Church. Then you had German churches as well, which their former slaves largely joined the Christian Convention, I believe. Now back to the Presbyterians. This affected the Congregationalists somewhat, but not as much as the Presbyterians. By this point, the Congregationalists had they'd published their Kansas City Statement of Faith, and their beliefs were kind of solidified. But of course, each church was able to ordain its own minister. They were able to judge their minister on their own beliefs. Not so in the Presbyterian Church. A new division was forming. And it all kind of started with this, it didn't start with him, but a big figurehead was Charles Augustus Briggs, who was a professor at the Union Seminary in New York City, which was a very liberal seminary. He was a critic of biblical infallibility, the belief that the Bible was inerrant as it was written, this idea of only using the King James Version. He didn't believe in all of that, and also disagreed with some of these rigid interpretations of the Westminster Confessions, which had been created by the Scottish Church in the 1500s. In 1891, the General Assembly, seeing him as too liberal, vetoed his appointment as a theology professor at Union. Union refused to comply and instead disaffiliated itself from the PCUSA, and to this day is still an independent seminary. And so they could ordain him or put him into power as a theology professor themselves. So in 1892, Mr. Briggs was tried for heresy by New York Presbytery, but was found not guilty. The General Assembly, in response, issued what was called the Portland Deliverance, which stated that any minister who does not accept biblical inerrancy should leave the denomination. Now, in 1893, New York Presbytery again tried Briggs innocent, but upon appeal, the General Assembly overturned the ruling and defrocked Briggs, and he subsequently joined the Episcopal Church. But this was a huge issue. This is a cover of the General Assembly of 1892, the Presbyterian Issues, and it says Revision and Dr. Briggs in small print. And so, this was, people all across the country were watching this trial of Dr. Briggs. Now, one of his supporters was a man named Henry Van Dyke, who was also a hymn writer. He authored Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee, and later was an ambassador to the Netherlands and Luxembourg, and also officiated Mark Twain's funeral. So in 1903, he led a committee to revise the Westminster Confession of Faith, which included former President Benjamin Harrison, and really emphasized atonement and God's universal love over other issues like criticizing the Pope and other issues that were in the Westminster Confession that were mostly, had kind of become they'd become dated. They were no longer a major focus of the church and did not need to be. Meanwhile, in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, they had ordained the first woman in a Presbyterian denomination in 1889, Louisa Woolsey. Now that caused a whole lot of controversy between more conservative and liberal elements in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church. And the changes that the PCUSA made as a result of Henry Van Dyke's committee in 1903 to the Westminster Confessions, many of those in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church who had previously found the PCUSA to be too rigid on these things felt more at home. And by this point, a lot of their divisions had been set aside, so a majority of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church merged into the PCUSA in 1906. However, a sizable minority, largely conservative, remained. And in 1955, they would split again, and you have a very small body called the Upper Cumberland Presbyterian Church, which only has about a handful of churches, which was formed mainly in opposition to the civil rights movement, and it still exists in some parts of Alabama and Mississippi. Now, in 1910, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA issued what they called 5 fundamentals, and they were the inerrancy of Scripture, the virgin birth of Christ, atonement theory, physical resurrection, and the existence of miracles. And the followers of this group became known as the fundamentalists, and they started issuing a pamphlet called the Fundamentals, which rejected any type of criticism or further study of the Bible. Now, one of those who was against the fundamentalists was Harry Emerson Fosdick. He felt they were going too far. He had been Baptist, but later became a Presbyterian pastor, and in 1922 delivered a sermon strongly critiquing the fundamentalists called "Shall the Fundamentalists Win?" He was tried for heresy, but rejoined the Baptist Church before he could be tried, before he was found guilty. Elder John Dulles was his attorney, so to speak, at the liturgical trial that he had. He would go on to become Secretary of State, and I believe it's the one who Dulles Airport is named after. I believe that's the same Dulles. And those who sided with Fosdick and those in his camp were known as modernists. So you had this big debate between the modernists and fundamentalists. Now, one of these fundamentalists was a former Cumberland Presbyterian Church member named William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president in 1896. He was a Democratic nominee. He did not win. He lost to William McKinley, who then, of course, was shot and replaced by Teddy Roosevelt. And though politically a progressive, he was theologically a very strong fundamentalist. His opposition to modernism went hand in hand with his opposition to Darwinism, his opposition to evolution, and was actually a counsel at the famous 1925 Scopes trial in Tennessee, which, debated whether creationism had to be taught in schools alongside evolution. In response to the 5 fundamentals, a group of moderates led by Robert Nichols, who was a professor at Asbury Seminary, which, if you'll recall, had been founded by Asbury. Never mind, I'll go into all that right now. But it was part of the New School. Sorry, I meant to say Auburn, not Asbury. Auburn Theological Seminary. I don't know why I wrote Asbury up there, but Auburn had been aligned with the New School and rejected biblical inerrancy, instead affirming freedom of interpretation. They also rejected the General Assembly's pattern of telling presbyteries what they could or could not believe. So in the past, it was a presbytery, they could ordain a minister, but that could be overturned by the denomination if they felt this minister's beliefs were not in accordance with the rest of the church. Under the Auburn Affirmation, this allowed presbyteries to kind of make up their own mind as to who they wanted to ordain. Thus, presbyteries now had freedom of conscience regarding ordination standards. Excuse me. Also in the Northern Church, you had women playing an increasingly major role in the church. In 1922, women were approved. They approved to women to be allowed to be deaconesses or deacons. In 1930, the General Assembly voted to allow women to be ordained as elders. The first woman is up here, Sarah Ellen Dixon. She was the first woman to be ordained as an elder. She had been ordained a deaconess in 1925, and just 2 days after the vote to allow women to be elders, she was ordained an elder in her home congregation. Another famous woman was Pearl Buck, who was a Southern missionary in the Southern Church to China. And she argued that missions should not be focused so much on evangelism, although she did not discount that. She thought evangelism was very important, but they should also be advocating for and implementing structural change in the countries where they were missionaries. Now, fundamentalists in the Southern Church were furious. They thought that a missionary's job was to the gospel and to the gospel only. And so they tried to remove her from the Board of Foreign Missions. And this caused a split in the Board of Foreign Missions, where fundamentalists formed what they called the Independent Board for Presbyterian Foreign Missions, the IBPFM. Interestingly, in 1938, Pearl Buck became the first American woman to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. In the meantime, though, in both the Southern and Northern churches, you had this split between fundamentalists and modernists growing very strongly, especially in the Northern Church. The Southern Church was still mostly fundamental, but in the Northern Church, you had modernists taking on more and more power. And in 1925, Princeton Seminary was really kind of the ground zero for this big debate. You had a New Testament professor there named John Gresham Machen, and Machen was firmly a fundamentalist. And in 1929, when the PCUSA placed modernists on the Princeton's Board of Trustees, he and several other fundamentalists left and organized Westminster Theological Seminary, which is still near Philadelphia. The PCUSA refused to recognize Westminster as an approved seminary. They considered it to be a kind of an outlaw institution. It was operating outside of the jurisdiction of the General Assembly. But attendance there was encouraged by fundamentalist ministers. In 1936, Machen and other fundamentalists, including those who are part of the Independent Board of Presbyterian Missions, met in Philadelphia and decided they'd had enough. They separated from the PCUSA and formed the much more strictly theological Presbyterian Church of America, which they changed their name in 1939 to the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. They had a very strong emphasis on scriptural infallibility, but they stayed out of national politics largely. They were kind of libertarian. Machen was very libertarian in his beliefs, instead encouraging Christians to take control of affairs by establishing private schools and sending their kids there. And the Orthodox Presbyterian Church is still active today. Westminster continues to be their seminary. There's an OPC church out on Mill Road, out past Winton Woods Golf Course, right before you reach the interstate, out 275 out there, a very small church on your right. Well, even after forming this new church, the Orthodox Presbyterians had trouble because in 1937, Machen died, which left a power struggle in his wake. Now, the OPC decided they did not want to get involved in politics, and this included the enforcement of prohibition, which in the late 1930s was a very big issue. You know, there were those in the church who thought that the church should take a stand. The PCUSA had backed off enforcing prohibition. The OPC, you had members who thought they should be more forceful about enforcing prohibition. And so some of these stronger fundamentalists who wanted a more vocal church in public affairs were really part of the minority in the OPC, but they broke away and formed a new church called the Bible Presbyterian Church. They founded a seminary called Faith, which is still active in Baltimore, and they are still active today. They are not a very large denomination, only have about 30 members, 30 congregations on the roll, But they do have a church in Sharonville, oddly enough. So, like I said, they are much more conservative, even than the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And part of that is because of their leader, a guy named Carl McIntyre. Now, he had been a fundamentalist member of the PCUSA and subsequently the OPC and founded the BPC. And he remains the de facto leader of the Bible Presbyterian Church pretty much through most of his life until he got too old and sick to be able to run it. It really became, for a lot of people, a cult of personality around him. He was also a pioneer in the use of telecommunications for evangelism, got into using television and radio, especially radio. One of my favorite stories about him is that his radio broadcasting license was revoked by the FCC, and so he formed what was called a pirate radio station. He got a boat, went out into international waters, and started broadcasting his message. He was only online for about a day before the boat caught on fire, which is just really funny to me for some reason. He was very far right, was a strong advocate for segregation and for the Vietnam War. He also refused to associate with any groups, any Christian group that did not share his positions, and also refused to associate with any group that associated with any other groups. So it couldn't just be Marty and I disagree, or it couldn't just be Marty and I agree on something. If Marty and Alice disagree on something, or if I and Alice disagree on something, but Marty and Alice are friends, even if Marty and I agree on that object, I couldn't be friends with Marty because he was involved with Alice, and that made him sinful. As you can imagine, McIntyre's love for publicity and his rather dictatorial style turned members of the Bible Presbyterian Church against him. In 1955, over half the denomination left and formed what they called the Columbus Synod, later became known as the Evangelical Presbyterian Church Columbus Synod, which is not the same as the Evangelical Presbyterian Church that exists today. They founded their own seminary, Covenant, in St. Louis, and that's a picture of their seminary there, which is still active today. In the meantime, they were a small denomination and began exploring options to merge with another denomination. You had the Reformed Presbyterian Church General Synod, which had been formed in 1833 by New Light members of the Reformed Presbyterian Church. They had not joined with the United Presbyterian Church of North America when that denomination was created. They remained independent. But over the past, 130 years, they had moved away from their old traditions of being covenanters and became more evangelical. And so in 1965, the EPC and the Reformed Presbyterian Church merged to form the Reformed Presbyterian Church Evangelical Synod, which was a small but important denomination, and they will come into play next week when we talk about the formation of the Presbyterian Church of America. So I know that was a lot. That's all for today, though. We still have about 20 minutes, so are there any questions for me?